And okay, okay, thank you. All right, cool. Let's go again here.
The failure of regulation most likely occurs when the excesses of corporate greed bleeds into the essential rights individuals ought to own. In this debate, we're talking about land and ownership and being able to find a house in the very first place. And when companies like BlackRock own 13% of the US's residential complex, that is when you know you have a problem with regulation. What is our model on banning? The first thing I want to point out is that this is going to be a complete ban on future acquisition by registered corporate entities for these kinds of public housing complexes, but it also looks like the dismantling of existing and current ownership arrangements by the majority of these kinds of companies. This will probably be done through a transitional period of maybe 5 to 10 years to ensure to avoid any kinds of things like capital flight, etc. This is going to be a gradated process. So what this does essentially is either frees up for complete housing ownership as opposed to rent, or the acquisition of these houses by individual landlords who are not corporate entities. We're perfectly fine with both of these comparatives. 3 points today. Firstly, who are the corporations that are talking about this debate and why they're really, really large? Secondly, what are the benefits to the housing market as a result of this? And finally, why is regulation impossible? First, who are these corporations we're talking about? We are talking about large corporations, many of whom have backgrounds in other areas like investment banking and have large capital flows. There are 2 reasons for why this frame is particularly likely in this debate. The first is that it is uniquely these kinds of corporations who have the greatest capacity to buy out entire residential districts at high costs due to high amounts of capital reserves. Many of these corporations have the ability to cross-pollinate across different industries and capital flows to absorb the short-term losses, given that majority of rental models typically only get returns across large periods of time. So these are the unique companies that are able to do this as opposed to others. But secondly also, they have the incentive to do this because they want to gain a competitive influence in pricing, the ability to price residential markets and rents in the market. So they often do this at a district level as opposed to an entire national level. You might buy out the entire houses in a particular district of a particular state to do this. So generally speaking, these kinds of corporations are really, really large. They have very lots of capital and the ability to set prices. First argument, what are the benefits to the housing market? First, in terms of benefits to the prices of housing, we think what we do right now is reduce the monopolistic or oligopolistic power to set prices in individual districts above market rates. Because what corporations are able to do right now is the elimination of competition insofar as they're able to price out and outbid a majority of individual landlord owners who therefore are unable to compete them at market rates. What you therefore do on our side of the house is the introduction of private ownership back into the market who are monopolistic competitive, who have the incentive to lower prices to a degree that is markedly competitive. Why is this? The second reason why this also reduces the power to set high prices is that oftentimes many of these monopolistic corporations we reduce their capacity and incentive for them to engage in a myriad of other kinds of predatory practices in the housing market. For instance, many of these corporations often do things like lobby governments for very onerous zoning laws that make housing prohibitively expensive for the majority of individual landlords. So this could look like, for instance, setting a requirement for this house to have an individual parking garage even when housing and cars are not that expensive or are not that useful in a particular area, which increases the price of being able to own a rental flat as an individual landlord. So both of these mechanisms are eliminated on the outside of the house, increasing the capacity for competition to be reintroduced in the market and therefore reduce the prices. Why is this argument important? It's important especially due to the inelasticity of housing we're talking about today, and which therefore increases the extractive influence of majority of these corporations insofar as an increase in price does not have a corresponding reduction in quantity demanded, given that majority of these houses are indeed things that people need. But secondly, also, we think that there are benefits to the quality of housing as well. Why? Because we restore and reassert consumer agency to choose between housing options insofar as not the entire district is not singularly owned in a while by these individual corporations, which reduces the agency of individual house owners and rental owners on our side of the house. Which therefore suggests that you're able to therefore increase incentive for these individual homeowners and individual rental landlords and outside of the house to improve the quality of housing insofar as there is a competitive influence by reasserting agency to the position of consumers. Before I continue, sure.
What is the incentive then for housing development projects to ever happen on your side? Because the developers have no one to sell it to. I don't think individual landlords are going to buy these mega projects.
Well, there are many individual landlords who are able to buy out these contracts, or alternatively, people who just buy the houses and own those houses. I think that's what happens in the majority of other kinds of countries, like Singapore, for instance. Final argument. Why is regulation fairly impossible? The first tier of this argument is, broadly speaking, why the ability to regulate in relation to corporate capture is uniquely impossible. The first reason for this is that there are large monetary interests in intense lobbying, which therefore reduces the capacity for these things to pass. But secondarily, also there's a revolving door effect, insofar as a majority of individuals in the public sector regulatory agencies have aspirations towards the private sector, given that that's where the majority of the money is. They have no incentives to regulate against their future employers. But secondly, also, the enforcement of these kinds of regulations is very, very difficult. The first reason for this is because large corporate residential landlords have huge legal teams that drag out lawsuits and find loopholes in laws. But secondly, also, even in the cases where they lose, the losses they incur are negligible compared to the huge profits and resources that they have. But secondly, also, even if you were to assume that some degree of regulation were possible, many of the kinds of regulations that we're talking about in this debate, such as things like rent controls and price controls, create large amounts of harm. There are several harms. The first is that imperfect information means that it's difficult to price and control prices to a degree that is acceptable to the market. This is because the market is already distorted insofar as the majority of these houses are owned by corporate residential landlords. It is difficult for the government to find out what the optimum price is. The second reason, though, is that it further entrenches monopolies. Why is this the case? Because the majority of people who are priced out at the point at which you apply rent control and pricing controls are the smaller individual landlords who are unable to afford the lower prices, which therefore means that any attempt at regulation on the outside of the house further entrenches monopolies. The third reason, though, is that even if you are able to acquiesce to some degree of lower rental pricing, what you often do is these corporations give up on other aspects, i.e. lower cut costs and reduce the quality of these houses, which further hurts these kinds of consumers we're talking about. But fourth and most importantly, many of these other kinds of regulatory options are really unpopular, given the fact that at the point in which you reduce prices, oftentimes these individuals are going to reduce the amount of houses they sell and put up for rent, which creates a shortage in the market, which therefore reduces the number of houses available to the majority of these consumers who want to rent houses, which therefore creates a political unpopularity in terms of these kinds of regulatory policies. Comparatively, at the point in which you instill a complete ban, you're able to therefore return some degree of agency to individual homeowners and home buyers, or individual landlords who are therefore able to offer prices at a more competitive degree that is increasing quality and therefore benefits both these particular actors.
The first thing I want to address is that they assume in this world today, most people want to own houses. I don't think that is fair. In most urban cities, I think generally people prefer to rent. Why? Not only because owning a house is incredibly expensive, no matter who develops the house. I think at the end of the day, land is just becoming more and more important, more and more rare, so prices will always increase. So I think no matter how much you try to regulate, subsidize, it will still be an expensive endeavor to go into. That's number one. Number two, this is going to be a long-term investment. Maybe one day, maybe at once upon a time, a lot of people, once they get a job, they know 30 years I'm going to have a job, it'll be fine. But these days, someone can get fired after 6 months, climates can change, you don't know what is going to happen. How are you going to be able to afford a long-term investment every month when you decide to purchase a home? A lot of people are not willing to make that calculated risk and don't buy houses at all. This is number two. Number three, people move. A lot of times people don't generally stay in the same cities. If they're feeling they're not vibing or whatever nonsense, or they get an opportunity to travel and move elsewhere, that's what they will do. Purchasing a house in these circumstances just doesn't seem like the right move to do, on top of the fact that this is an incredibly expensive investment that may not pay off in the long term or in the long term future anyway. So I think this is where the debate needs to operate. It cannot be about how this will incentivize all the different players now to approach development on all of this demographic which don't care about purchasing a house. I think that is the issue that we need to contend with. But before I go on, yes.
If it is true that currently many of these corporate residential landlords are monopolistic and crowd out individual rent owners, will individual rent landlords not just simply reassert their place in the market insofar as the spell is passed?
Yeah, but if I'm an individual landowner, I can't purchase, 300,000 units and maintain it and manage it to an effective level. And even if I am successful in doing that, if at any point I feel the risk is not worth it or I'm too tired or I want to pull out, I pull out, I'm gone. All the renters who rely on me for stability have nowhere to turn to and wait for another rich individual landlord to take my place, which is harder to find compared to another rich corporation who wants to invest in the real estate market. I think that's the biggest difference. Now, let's just do a bit of dismantling. He tells you now what's going to happen is that even for current projects, we're going to implement this policy. We're going to give you 5 years to transition, 5 to 10 years to transition. Here's the problem. Number one, all you do is give corporations an opportunity to use this period of transition to circumvent this regulation as well. So find the individuals who can represent their interests and they become the landlords, and then they will be managed by the corporations through different means, or they will create subsidiaries. That's what corporations do at any point in time. You give them a grace period because you want to be nice to them. Generally speaking, this model that they're proposing just doesn't work and is a burden on them to show not only that this is a good idea, but that it will be executed well enough to materialize all these benefits. I'm telling you, in all likelihoods, it won't change anything. We're stuck with corporations owning our land. How do we make best of it? I think that is where the debate is won. Last thing I want to say about their case is that everything operates on the assumption that when these incentives change, development will now verge towards either individual landlords or individual homeowners or any other alternatives they have planned, without explaining the incentive structure as to why. Just because there's an absence of a major player doesn't automatically mean that land will continuously be developed for houses. Land will be developed for other purposes that corporations can still engage with. Land will just not be developed. It will just stay barren, or it will just be purchased in the long term. Even if people have to sleep under bridges, that's not corporations' problem. And governments can compel individuals, hey, I already limit the corporations, buy the fucking house now. What am I going to do? You can't do that. At the end of the day, it's up to the consumer. And we are telling you, generally speaking, consumers are not interested in what you're offering them to this extent. I'll be a bit generous, yes.
Strong demand for home ownership and home rent.
I think there's a strong demand for not having to pay a lot to live somewhere. But I don't think it matters whether I'm paying monthly installment to the bank or I'm paying monthly installments to my landlord. The only difference is this. If I purchase a house and I'm paying lower monthly installments, 5 years from now when I lose my job or I get an opportunity in New York, what am I going to do with this property? Especially since I can't even sell it to a corporation. I have to wait for the perfect individual to now buy this house from me at profit, and then I have to do the whole process again in a different city that I'm going to live 5 years from now. That's context. I'm just telling you that in this context, who is attracted by buying a house? Certainly not this average reasonable individual. Maybe in Singapore it's a bit different, but Singapore is an anomaly. We all agree. They are perfect. They are the best. Amazing. Go Singapore. But, I just don't think the world is at that level yet, So what to do? If we could all be like Singapore, immediately. Give me that chicken rice, but that's how it works. Now, how am I adding to the debate? The first thing is, we tell you, generally, more development will happen in our world. Because the context of people preferring renters, sure, it will mean that more projects are developed because these corporations recognize that this is an attractive investment opportunity where they know there's a demand because people need to live. There's a need for people to be able to rent at a price that they can afford, and this is continuously going to be a demographic that they can exploit. So more development will happen. They tell you regulations fail and cause even greater harm. Fair. But that doesn't mean regulations in society is a failure as a whole. I think there are still mechanisms that you can do to ensure that this cannot go too much out of hand. Number one is, the first mechanism is obviously, if you fail to maintain these buildings well, you can be charged for criminal offense, or you can be charged for terrible civil offenses. And number two it is easier to keep them accountable because it's easier to go after a corporation because it can happen through a class action suit. So one corporation will own maybe 400,000 units in a city and fail to maintain 50% of these units. 50% of these units, if they gather up together, get the same lawyer, share in the costs, it's easy to keep them accountable versus going after each individual landlord who won't be managing this many properties, who won't be facing the same criticism from a variety of owners, and you're depending on these individual landlords to again fight the smaller guy and lose. Unlikely. In our world, there's always going to be an asymmetry of power because landlord, it's not a land peasant or something. Yes, so there's always going to be a person. This guy's always going to be more powerful than you. I don't think you're going to limit anything by shifting it into individuals. In fact, you make it harder to gang up against this huge entity, and it is our world where we think that will happen. So for long-term development, for the easy opportunity of maintenance, we tell you that corporations still need to rent buildings. I'm happy to have Apple as my landlord. Thank you.
Right, number 20 out. Okay, the PM, sorry.
You don't have to go all the way, but if Singapore is really so perfect, maybe they're doing something right, and you should try to copy them a little bit lah. It's pretty obvious to us that private landlords, especially the large ones, do an incredibly devastating harm towards the housing market as a whole, and I just don't think that their case is able to withstand the weight of that. How am I going to structure the speech? First, I'm going to run an extension to prove to you how we better home ownership. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about all that they've not engaged with in terms of corporate lobbying, and lastly, to explain to you why individual landlords and our comparatives is better. First, on the lie that I told you, I just don't think that absent of private residential landlords, there will be no development and no housing. That sounds really ridiculous, right? Sunway doesn't operate all of Sunway's home with the massive Sunway Corporation. People still need to buy houses. It's an essential need that needs to be bought, which means that if there are people who require the demand of buying houses because renting is not as much of an option on our side of the house, those people will go and buy houses. The demand is still existent. So it's unclear to me why that side of the house is the unique benefit in terms of fueling development. But the second thing is, it's unclear as to why this argument even is a harm at all. If people don't want to build new houses because there's a lack of demand on the side of the populace, that then suggests to you that houses aren't that important, that enough people live in houses that you don't need new houses anymore. The free market automatically adjusts for this by making sure that supply hits demand, which means that what you get on that side of the house is junk development, houses that end up empty because they build it for the purpose of selling it to these corporations at best, but people don't actually want those houses. So it's unclear to me why their argument has any positive benefit. Secondly, just a miscellaneous response. Their whole thing about corporations being able to create subsidiaries to avoid the ban, that's just ridiculous. We can track that. It's very obvious to find out when you're creating a subsidiary to try and create a loophole around the law. But if you buy the argument, then you have to concede that regulation becomes even more impossible on that side of the house because corporations have such smart tactics and many different ways to find loopholes around the law, so that only bites into their case. Extension. Why is it that we actually improve home ownership in these areas? The problem in status quo is that these large corporations, these large residential landlords, buy up large amounts of homes, even the ones that are newly built and do not have prior owners. This results in two phenomena that restrict home ownership. One, there are far less homes to buy, and the ones that are left are often not very attractive. They're located in inconvenient areas, probably poorly managed districts, which means people don't want to buy these homes. But secondly, and more importantly, the prices of homes for normal homeowners and buyers rise because there are less of them that are available for individual buyers of the home. That is to say, there is a supply shortage now, which means that the prices of home ownership rises exponentially. What this has resulted in is that in cities like New York, those who are willing and able to buy homes through things like mortgages and other means have to settle for rental apartments because they are unable to find the homes that they want, and they don't have the ability to pay for homes even if they take mortgages. On impact, this causes a few things. One, this causes economic harm towards these people because renting is generally more expensive than taking a mortgage from the bank, right? Think about it for a moment, right? If big landlords want to exploit you, they are going to charge you higher than the bank is going to charge you. But even if that's not true, you know what happens when you buy a home and you pay a mortgage? After 10 years, you own the home. You have the asset. That's hugely helpful economically for these people. But secondly, this solves the opposition question of who's going to buy these homes still. What
we suggest to you is that people really want to buy houses, but the fact that houses are so expensive now because all of them are bought by these private corporations means that they can't. Abolishing and banning these companies means that all of those homes are now freed up and the prices drop, which means that home ownership improves on the outside of the house, flipping the argument on them. But lastly, we suggest to you that this is the only alternative that exists to terrible renting systems that Joshua described. Home ownership is the way out, and the only way to do that is for you to abolish these companies. Before I move on, yes?
You don't engage with Ram's analysis that a lot of this land is owned by these companies, which will be the same on your side. Now they have no incentive to turn this into houses because they can't make money off of it. They'll likely just not develop houses there and use it for other profitable means. You do not have the same amount of land as us.
If we ban the companies, they don't own the land. Now, moving on. These companies being large. Joshua told you about how companies like BlackRock owns like 30% of the homes in America. I'm going to be more charitable. So if they are not monopolies, and even if they are oligopolies, I'm going to suggest to you a few big harms occur. The first is that prices in these areas are still incredibly high. This is because of rival consciousness. Oligopolistic markets often collude and follow the price of market leaders. But even if that is not the case, they're wary to lower prices as it becomes a race to the bottom, competing with other market leaders within the sphere, which means that in these areas like New York, the prices are often jacked up to be incredibly high. But secondly, even dealing with the best case scenario, so assuming that regulation is entirely possible, price controls only entrenched monopolies. They oftentimes have large profit margins and price gouging, which means that they are able to survive the kinds of legal limits that you put on price controls. Further than that, they buy apartments in bulk, meaning that the fixed cost per unit is much smaller. They are able to survive the process of rent control. Comparatively, this kills smaller landlords and small private corporations that are able to rent out these apartments. Why is this harmful? I suggest to you that even if they are able to set prices in a reasonable amount of time, the fact that monopolies are the ones that are able to survive that side of the house means that a few harmful effects occur. First of all, it means that these monopolies are able to implement cost-cutting measures, meaning that the kinds of homes that they are renting out is likely lower quality towards the average person. But secondly, monopolies bring like a whole other host of harms other than just reducing prices. Like often they block new housing and lobby for really bad regulations. So for instance, some of them lobby for like one parking garage per unit, which makes every apartment incredibly expensive within the district. All this to suggest to you that the kinds of monopolies that side of the house creates is generally really bad for the housing industry. Comparatively, this is better because individual landlords face far more accountability and check and balance mechanisms. You don't have the large amounts of reserves in terms of money to be able to fight the court in legal battles and drag it out, which means that they are far more risk averse in terms of setting proper prices and maintaining these homes properly. All this to suggest to you that it's more likely for you to get a better housing industry if smaller individual landlords are the ones who are ultimately going to buy out these houses. At the end of the day, what is the weighing here? First, we established to you that even if on that side of the house you get more homes being built, that is a bad thing because those homes don't match the demand. These private firms buy up these apartments in bulk, and if you believe that, that then means that these homes are not built based on the market demand, which means that they are junk and they should not be built in the first place. It wastes state money and it wastes large amounts of money in the economy. The second thing we proved to you is that even if that's the case, we get better home ownership because the problem now is a shortage caused by these companies buying up large amounts of home. Freeing that up by banning these companies means that they no longer own the land and the homes that they are in. But even if they do, it suggests to you that the prices are likely to go down because there's far more supply to go around to meet the demand of new homes that are going to be built. And we're willing to use that to trade off the idea of you being able to get more homes on that side of the house because it's a more accurate barometer. But lastly, preventing monopolies is the largest thing in this debate. So even if they are able to, in the short term, help the housing industry, preventing the formation of monopolies through our side of the house means that in the long run, you get far more sustainable policy. These policies are reversible. That is to say, if monopolies exist, it's possible for them to overturn the governmental regulations that are being instilled, and they only get bigger over time due to how lucrative the housing market is. Comparatively, if you ban this, you solve this problem and nip it in the bud, meaning that it can no longer get worse in the future. For all of these reasons, Gav.
Speech in 3, 2, 1. Well, Singapore chicken rice may be perfect for Singapore, but it may not be perfect for everyone else. So I'm happy that DPM has touched on house ownership because this is going to be my argument as well. So let me talk about, but let me just enter some rebuttals on what DPM has just said. Oh, they said, oh, the land, you're going to just ban all the corporations from owning land because they cannot build residential property. Hey, they can still own land, but they would just choose to build something else. They might build business districts, they might build commercialized districts, they might build industrial. So there will be less land for residential use. So if you're totally banning corporations from using the land to build residential property, from actually using them to actually buy the residential property, I'm sorry to say this land, there will be less and less land, less and less zoning for just residential properties. So now let me just feed on to my argument here. It's actually better for increasing house ownership. So why do I say this? Back in my LO just mentioned just now, most people nowadays, they prefer to rent. Why is this look like? Oh, this look like because housing price is too damn high. Our salaries is not matching the prices of homes. We all need to rent because everyone needs a roof under their heads, right? But the only way to do this now is to rent because rent is now cheaper than mortgages. So why do I say that it's better for increasing home ownership? Because of this modern initiative, rent to own. So usually in this rent to own model, corporations will own a vast majority of the houses. They own the houses. Developers, they own the houses. But how do they use this model to make sure house ownership go up? They simply rent the houses out long term, maybe a 1 year contract, 2 year contract, or maybe a 5 year contract. So how they rent it out for a relatively stable rental price, and hold on a minute, they have the option to, in like the end of the contract, they have the option to buy up the house at a fixed price that has been fixed before the contract has even been signed for the rental contract. Why why is this good? Because it lowers the barrier of entry for house ownership. Because let's say a house costs like 500,000 ringgit in like this year, and then I have to pay a rent for like 2,000 a month for the next like 1 or 2 years. Fine. I lock in the price of 500,000 at this instance. 2 years later, once my income increases, I can choose whether, hey, I like this house, I want to buy this house. So I will buy it at 500,000, which if you look at the financial cost, because your income goes up and everything goes up, but your house prices still stay the same. So you can actually buy, in relative terms, you buy the house for cheap, and that increases house ownership. This cannot happen on the individual side because individuals will not take the risk of rent to own because they simply do not have the capital, they simply do not have the resources, they simply cannot afford to do this. This is only viable on our side of the house. As we know, our side of the house has argued for many times that the market now is very terrible, especially for the young people. They don't have enough money to buy houses. So this in turn encourages house ownership in the future so that we can actually boost the house ownership and people can actually start to build wealth, because that's the main thing about house ownership compared to rents. Yes, everyone needs a roof above their head. They need to stay. But the only reason why people would choose to buy the house is to accumulate wealth for their next generation. This has been done for generations and generations. Yes, I can take a BRI now.
Yeah. We're not against renting you. Individual like landlords still exist outside the house, and if there's such a large demand for renting, that would be met by the market, no?
I mean, sure, individual, yes, you're not against renting, correct, but you're against corporate renting. So individuals, as explained by my LO just now, you're going to cause the rental market to just you don't have the right regulation, the maintenance to do it on your side of the house. On our side of the house, we argue that the corporations are the real managers. As explained by LO just now, they are able to better manage the scenarios, better manage how we actually implement this. Because the corporations, they have the incentive to make money. They have the incentive to actually make sure that their properties are sold out. That is what these developers are. Because if you don't have these incentives, I'm sorry, the corporations who own the land, they will just go and build business districts. They'll go and build industrial districts. Why in the world would they want to build residential if they can't make a buck? So that's why we cannot. That's why your word does not make sense. No, sit down. Does not make sense. I think she just add on to what my LO just now said about the PM just now said, oh, the current projects, like you get 5 years start transition. I just don't accept. We all know this loopholes and everything. We just come off the subsidiaries, everything. You said just now, we just go track down the subsidiaries. I'm sorry to say, it's very hard to sit down. we just can't track them all at once. You know, they are professionals here. The amount of lawyers, the amount of accountants, the amount of everything that they have, the amount of law people. Your arguments, you all just say about corporate robbery. They can find multiple loopholes here that you just can't solve. You are opening another Pandora's box out of another. So that's the reason why banning such things, it's so hard. So why not in our world we just regulate how the corporations rent out houses? How do they do this? How much they can jack up the prices? Because corporations, even though they don't have the incentive to suddenly jack up their price off because of one regulations, two reputation, three, and many stuff. So this is preposterous to say that if you ban corporate housing, it's gonna drop. And in your best idea that you say, oh, the housing prices will collapse because we're going to ban corporate ownership. This just defeats the purpose of house ownership. If you want the housing market to collapse, you're going to cause another 2008, 2009 style financial crisis, which was start by the housing bubble bursting. So I'm sorry to say, you do not look at the big picture here. You are just simply causing an economic collapse that is about to happen. So I don't know why you guys want to argue that this is the best scenario out of many scenarios that we can find. There's certainly so many different ways we can regulate this market, but I really do not understand your idea of just simply proposing a ban that will and for certain cause the institutional, financial, and social chaos that you will inflict by imposing this ban. And for all those reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
Sorry, I'll sit down so I can be seen on camera. The biggest issue with side opposition in this debate is that they're running a negative case, and that makes it very difficult for me as the whip to do clashes. But I think the best way we can characterize the way that they've defined their material is that the claim underpinning their argument is that no sufficient housing will be built on our side. So I'm going to call the clash that. Will sufficient housing exist? So the first question under this is whether people want to own homes. We think that people probably want to own homes because people want security, people want assets for the future. Homes are an investment. They're not only a place to live, they are assets that you can sell later on for money. And so when they tell you that, oh, people don't have buyers for their homes, and so they don't want to buy homes so they are not locked into not being able to move. We think that when this shift occurs from majority renters to majority homeowners, we think that people have to live somewhere, right? So presumably the people who used to rent on their side will become people who buy homes with mortgages on outside. And we think that that's a better outcome because at the end of it, they still have a better financial outcome, they still have assets for the future. This is a better thing than the money going to the landlords. Next, to these corporate big landlords. But next, the idea here is that even if people don't want to own, they want to live somewhere. And so there are market forces that mean that housing will still be constructed, small individual landlords will still exist, and people will still have places to live. First rebuttal. They tell you that companies own the land, so they will just not develop housing and that nobody else has the capacity to build houses. But companies are not a monolith, right? There's not just the big brother company that runs everything. There are companies that are purely like housing developers. There are companies that are purely these rent landlords that rent out individually to people. Presumably what happens on our side is what happens in status quo, right? Like, I don't know a big Malaysian developer, but Singapore with CapitaLand. CapitaLand buy like the land, CapitaLand build the condo, but CapitaLand sell the individual units in the condo out to individual homeowners and also to individual landlords that can then rent it out to people. There are mechanisms in the market for doing this. The incentive for these corporations is, of course, that they want to make money. If they cannot make money by directly renting it out, they will just sell it to someone else, right? And this is probably better for corporations as well, because the money that they get is instant, right? Once you sell the house, you already recoup your investment that you put into building the house. We think that there is still an incentive for companies to build these houses. Next, they tell you that companies will just build other things there. We think that number one, on the base level, this is not true. Like there are zoning laws that tell you what you can build on these areas. Presumably on land zone already for housing, it is incredibly difficult for you to just change it to become a commercial development. Governments also have an incentive to regulate this because they want housing for their people. They don't want people to be homeless on the streets. They will presumably zone the land in a way that incentivizes companies to build housing on these areas. The free market has forces that force companies to fill this demand, because if they don't fill this demand, the free market still wants to have houses, right? They'll just pay more, then it will incentivize companies to come in, then the prices will go down. Over the long arc of time, this will reach an equilibrium that is a fair price for these units. Why is it that this is still better than the comparative on their side? It's because landlords that consolidate, as we have already told you, can raise prices above the natural market price. These prices are extortionate. These prices affect the ability of people to buy these houses, and therefore I'm going to talk a little more about this later. The last thing on this clash is the idea that of their comparative that didn't come out in first, because their policy in first started at 6 minutes. At 5 minutes 50 seconds, the comparative came out in second of rent to own. Then my question is, if people are going to rent to own anyways, then presumably they are also okay with paying mortgages, right? Like, we think this undercuts their own analysis. But the second thing is that this is not exclusive. Rent to own schemes can still exist on our side. We just think that in the vast majority of cases, there's no incentive for corporations to do this when they can just milk the money from renting. They can just milk the money without having to give anything back to the consumer by giving them the deed to the house. They will just rent it out forever. Next, on the idea of who has better housing, we would like to note that this is the positive material and that has come out from our first speaker. We told you that we have fairer prices. We told you that we have better quality homes. We told you that people have better homes that they can live in. But this is something that was not really responded to down the bench. The best we had was mitigatory material. So I'm going to now explain why it is the case that comparatively the world on our side is a lot better because of the reasons we've already given you. The first idea is the idea that we eliminate lobbying. When corporations no longer buy all of these houses up, there is no incentive for these corporations, because they are no longer corporate landlords, to lobby for governments to do things like to do things like change zoning regulations to force unfavorable deals onto developers. This is the parking thing, right? If you have to build many parking units for each apartment, you are unlikely to build the apartment because a lot of your land area has to be dedicated to parking instead of apartments, and you can get less money as a developer from selling those houses. That is the kinds of mechanisms we have already given you and were not responded to show you why more housing is built on our side, and therefore this is the flip to their whole argument. Number two, we told you that this will lead to fairer prices because there is no monopolistic market concentration on our side. The reason why this doesn't occur is because these small landlords individually each want money, right? So they will compete with each other to compete on price and compete on quality with the other small landlords in the area. This is a better alternative than one landlord controlling all the units in the entire area that we told you was already likely due to the idea of BlackRock and these companies with huge capital capacity to buy these things up. But before that, I'll take a PY.
So you're saying that we don't have regulations on our side because you can lobby, and you use the example of zoning, but your side, for your arguments for why they won't abuse this land to do other stuff on it, is because you also have zoning laws that for some reason corporations won't lobby.
Yeah, as in, of course they will lobby, but to make that argument, you must first explain what these regulations look like, right? We think that insofar as a comparative doesn't exist on your side, you cannot claim the same extent of benefits. But true, corporations can lobby, but comparatively, of course, when the ban already exists and you've already used your political capital in this debate that we are given by fiat to implement this ban, presumably it becomes a lot harder for corporations to prevent this kind of development. We think that this sort of argument only makes sense when you have a counter policy that you can comparatively explain has a lower political capital required to prevent lobbying. But they don't do that, so it doesn't work. Finally, the idea of better quality. We think that people just deserve good homes. We think that alternative policies that could exist on their side that they didn't even argue, things like rent control, don't comparatively achieve this because it is not possible for the same market incentives or competition to incentivize landlords to build better housing with better quality amenities that better suit the needs of the individual people. We think that this is a benefit exclusive to our side and the free market mechanisms that we have told you in this debate. This is why, exclusively on our side, we better create housing, we build more housing, we build better housing, and people therefore have better housing markets on our side. And we think this therefore meets the ban threshold that we had as a burden in this debate compared to them, which don't explain properly why there are alternatives that exist to a ban. Thank you so much.
Oh. I'm not sure how the housing situation is in Singapore, but it can't be that good. Otherwise, people wouldn't be living in JB and driving all the way there just to work. Because clearly things are expensive there, or you clearly do not have enough houses. I don't understand why this model is one that's effectively going to work then. But secondly, they don't also explain how this translates into what they want. And I think this is just a few explicit problems I want to call out from side government here. One, it's for some reason they live in a utopian world. Just because people want things suddenly means that they can do it. The entire argument as to why home ownership increases is just because people want homes. Like, duh, no shit. Well, obviously people want homes. You don't explain as to why they have the capacity to do it, or why likely things change on your side. Like, bro, like government wants to win this debate, but I don't think they have the capacity to, so clearly they're out of this anyway then. But secondly then, in terms of the alternatives that they provide, they just for some reason want to push that, oh, the alternatives is, because now there's no actor here, the alternatives is that landlords will suddenly all buy up these houses and therefore rent these things out. They don't explain as to why this is likely going to happen in the first place, because you don't explain as to why people are likely going to want to become landlords, because obviously there's going to be now a lot of houses that are unowned by these corporations. Who is going to buy these things up? It's probably going to be new landlords who suddenly enter the market. You don't explain as to why there's probably that many people in the first place who want to become landlords or have the capacity to literally buy a second house and rent these things out and deal with all the maintenance costs and all these, just the mental dealings of having to like literally rent out something to someone else. But second, then you don't prove as to why the existing landlords are suddenly going to have enough capital to also buy out these things then. So I think you have to concede to some degree that there are going to be houses that are unowned. The only way that the answer to this is that, oh, now people will just directly buy houses. But this falls to the lack of analysis that I mentioned. How do they have the capacity? Because they don't explain as to why anything else in the world changes. People still have the same live in capitalism. They still have the incentives that, okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to live here for the next 5 to 10 years. Why am I likely going to buy the house? I rent it here because I know then if I suddenly have to move tomorrow, I can just end my lease contract and then I can move elsewhere. You don't explain as to why these incentives or why these functions likely change. Just because you change this policy in terms of banning corporations from owning these things, then you have to concede then that people own houses less. So I think that's just one. The first question about the scale of housing then. We explained to you as to why less development happens simply because for these reasons. Sure, maybe you still have your development or corporations that want to develop this land and sell it to landowners and all that, but you have to concede that one, they're less likely to do this because in certain areas, they probably just cannot get the buy-in for people to directly buy these houses or the direct buy-in for landlords to suddenly want to buy these units to rent them out. But secondly then also, it's just in terms of the incentives of having the land to do it in the first place. I don't know why second comes up and says, oh, because we ban this, it means that corporations suddenly don't own the land in the first place. This is a second policy, like it's a separate policy. You don't explain as to how this is integrated into just the banning of house residential, like corporations using this as a residential land. But secondly then, you don't explain as to what this means, and the implications are quite bad, because if you are literally saying that this will also implicate just not any land ownership, then literally means that companies don't own factories, don't own buildings. So what's the model on your side then? Companies cannot own anything and that is just some guy from somewhere has to rent out the entire factory land towards these people. You don't explain as to how land ban or land ownership changes on your side. It's likely then that the lands that is owned by the corporations, which is a lot by the way, which is why this became a market in the first place, likely stays the same, which is why all these features that came out from first and second on our side was so important, because we explained to you as to why if you do not allow this to be a profit incentivized thing for these companies to do, they're just going to do the other next best thing for this. Turn this into factory land, turn this into commercial districts. You don't contend then that is a lot of lost land on your side then, which means that your entire burden about saying that there is a supply shortage of houses likely goes far worse, because there's just less land to work with and prices shoot up then. Because the reason as to how you get rent prices to go down is because you just have more houses to buy. So sure, on your side you don't get these monopolies and all these things then, but it's very likely that because you just have less houses, the landlords individually also understand like, hey, this guy can't go anywhere else, I'm literally going to sell it and like squeeze this guy out because there's not enough houses to go around. Even you can see that this is likely a problem in the first place then. Secondly then, and I hate this in monopoly debates, in economics debates, everyone likes to throw the word monopoly bad, monopoly bad. Why? Monopolies are good in one sense because they have a lot of capital to bring in and to ensure that these things are stable. We explained to you as to why the mental calculus of a renter is that I want to be able to rent this house for a stable price for a long time, or at least for as long as I want this. Then it is only through very big corporations that you have this stability, because they see this as a very substantial business model. They have the capacity to make up for these losses or whatever. These do not exist with individual landowners. In the moment in which I suddenly find that, okay, I don't want to live in the big city and I want to move into this different house, I have to tell the guy that I'm renting out to, like, I want this house back, you have to leave within the next month, or these things. These are the sorts of protections that you only get when these things are owned by corporations, because they have to be held to a higher standard than individual landowners. Before that, yes. I don't know, but one is determined by the bank, one is determined by like housing markets. But you also have to contend in the housing market. Like, I don't think individual landlords are suddenly making up prices on their own. They probably have to like also see what the current prices are going on. It's very likely that things are symmetrical, especially because a lot of housing prices are tied towards land scarcity and land availability, which is far worse on your side when we explain to you that you're just going to get less land that's developed for housing in the first place then. So explain to you as to why scale of housing is just far better on our side when you have more development projects and more confidence in the fact that these things can be done well. Secondly, then that goes into quality of housing. The only argument they have for quality of housing is that now you have to be more competitive and people want nicer houses, so you suddenly can do it. Again, once without proving capacity. What is the capacity for an individual landlord to suddenly make his house damn nice and always have good maintenance, water is always working, all those sorts of things? These are things that are best done by corporations that have specific management teams and can afford to do these things because they have experts. What is some guy going to do if suddenly the pipes break and like no plumbers are available? That guy is to say like, sorry bro, no water for 1 week. These are sorts of things that is far more difficult for you to hold accountable then. And that goes on the third point in terms of accountability. You think that, okay, it's easier to hold one guy accountable than a corporation, but you have to think of it from the renter's point of view. If I am renting from individual person, do you think I'm likely going to take all the legal things of hiring a lawyer just to sue this one stupid fella, or I'm just going to find a different house to rent from? It is only when these things are owned by corporations, and a lot of people are affected by who you can collectivize around, which is where you get the legal action. On your side, sure, it's individuals you're going against, but now you're also defending yourself as an individual. They're likely not going to take the risk and spend so much money in terms of taking legal action. Accountability is far worse. The quality of management is also far worse on your side then. So lastly then is this anti-argument of home ownership, which for some reason they want to take up. Again, they don't prove as to why. Just because people want it, they're able to get it. But we explain to you, even if this is the burden of debate, it's far better on our side then, because it's only through this rent-to-own model, which can only be provided by corporations. Jason explains to you as to why corporations can uniquely offer this service, because the way in which it works is that you actively, like, you set a rent period and then you sell them at a price that you agreed before you started this contract. Only corporations are willing to do this because they have the teams in order to do these sorts of calculations, and they're the only ones who are willing to take the risk of selling it at a price now in the future. What single landlord is suddenly going to say, okay, you rent my house for 5 years, I'm suddenly going to sell it to you for the price I agreed with it individually like 5 years ago then? You don't explain as to why the incentives happen there. But secondly then, in terms of just land, as to why home ownership doesn't increase, is because the land scarcity thing I talked about then. Again, your entire argument about home ownership is the fact that there's more development and people just want to buy things then. We explained to you why. People do not have different capacities on your side then, but land is far more reduced. So actually now the housing that you have available for people to buy just become far more expensive, and people cannot access these things in the first place then.
Hmm.
You just take one.
Oh yeah, sure, next. Okay. Starting my reply in 3, 2, 1. Judge, there's been many clashes in this round. And yes, government has made some government has made some good points here. But the thing is, whether they can overcome opposition's case, which I think they can't. So let's identify the main clash I see in this debate: the scale of housing. Why? Because in government side, they keep on arguing, oh, we're going to ban the corporations, we're going to increase house ownership, we're going to use the land for other purposes. But we on side opposition that already proved this is not the case. The land is already owned by the corporations. The land will be used for other purposes such as business. And the zoning laws, as explained by Whip just now, and that it just can be changed by what you guys say, lobbying. So zoning laws doesn't make sense in this debate. So your idea of this perfect world completely falters here when you ban ban this corporate housing, and then we need to think about the consequences of banning this. Your house just sees the short-term vision of the populist ideal of, okay, let's just ban BlackRock, let's just ban all these corporations from owning property. But you do not see the long-term vision, the economic scale of all this. If you just suddenly just cut off, just make these changes, you're just going to cause an economic collapse, as just mentioned by the second speaker just now. So if you look back, what the first speaker of opposition just said about more about accountability, they make more sense, because the first speaker here, you guys mentioned that, oh, the individuals are more risk adverse. They will usually care because they have small risk. But you need to think about it. It's a one-to-one scenario. A one-to-one scenario here, there is no possibility that the renter who usually are on the lower end will be able to actually sue the house owner, because they are at an unfair advantage. It's called landlords, not land peasants, as explained just now. The landlords will always have the power. But in our world, it works better, because in our world, we have a bunch of people, let's say you just say just now, buy our entire neighborhood. Then the neighborhood community will just sue the organization. That is the purpose here. That's why accountability on our side of the house is actually more, it makes sense. And we look at what we call the quality of housing. I do not see how individual landowners have the capability or have the incentive to keep on upgrading their houses. As we can see, those people owned by individual housing, they are usually on worse quality. They usually do not really maintain. You need to have many phone calls for the house owner to respond. While in the management company or companies owned by houses owned by companies, they usually have an entire team to actually help you solve your problems, such as piping, such as Wi-Fi, such as cooking gas. All this is all inside your contract. It's all inside these big teams that they have many people to help you out and assist you. So I do not see the vision that you guys are placing. So the debate, Josh, the thing here is the debate here falls on whether we should ban housing ownership for the rent and to rent out for corporations. And because this is such a high burden to prove, we do not see the government proving to us why in their world we will have a more stable financial market, a more stable housing market, a more stable economy, a more stable life for all people around. Because we need to think, there's all these stakeholders here. We have the corporations, we have the people, we have the government. These are all stakeholders in our world here, and this is why government has failed to prove. And I just imagine that their world is just a very elitist view that does not take into consideration the mass need of the people. And this is why we are proud to oppose a Malaysia Boleh.
Okay lah, we came from Singapore to Malaysia. If you want to know the real reason, it's because we think the food's better. But other than that, it's because the Airbnb that we booked actually looked pretty nice, and it was actually like decently affordable. And that's the reason why we came here, and then we didn't go to like America Debate Open, because the apartments there are like $5,000 per unit, right? And that's the key in this debate. We're not debating Singapore versus Malaysia or whatever weird system, because in Malaysia, they don't follow this model of private landlord ownership. What occurs is in America, in cities like New York, where these big mega corporations, these mega lords are able to buy up apartments. And we think that is the problem. That's the problem we set up from the very, very beginning, and we're still going to follow this line down. What is the problem with that? The problem is that megalords are bad because there's no accountability against them. They said that these monopolies can make up for losses, and that's the problem. We think that when they can make up for losses, it's very, very difficult for you to regulate and combat them. Comparatively, banks and individuals have to compete with each other in the same region. Even if these big private enterprises are not like owning every single house in the country, the fact that they own houses in one region means that there's no competition in that region. The fact that housing is essential means that there is price inelasticity in terms of demand, which means people have to buy from them. That's how that form of exploitation took place. We never actually heard a comparative that's able to deal with this problem, which means that the trade-off isn't worth it. Like, even if we have not enough houses or too much houses for some reason, it's better that all of the houses that does exist are affordable and that people can buy it. The problem setup never got resolved, so people can't actually afford renting and they have to now take up loans. We think that's a really, really bad thing. But the second thing is, I don't think their argument can be brought to the fullest extent. Like, okay, you look at all the buildings out there, right? Quite nice, right? The government case is that if the private enterprise don't exist, all of those buildings disappear. Tonight you sleep in Sunway University. Cannot be, right? Like, if these private corporations don't buy up the houses, don't buy up the land, right? The realistic alternative is that they use the land for stuff like commercial development as they establish. You know when these companies use land for commercial development? When there is no demand for housing in that region. So if no one wants to buy houses in this part of the land, what they do is that they build a mall, or they use it for industrial purposes, or they sell the land away. What the free market on our side of the house do when there isn't monopolies is that there is an allocation mechanism. So people who want to buy house in this region, the land developer will build the house. If that doesn't exist, that means that there was no demand in the first place. So you get the perfect amount of houses for everyone in that region and the correct price for those people. That's the incentive, profit maximizing. This also answers the question that they gave to us, which was, why don't corporations lobby on our side of the house? Because they don't have to. The fact that they are able to match the demand within this region means that they don't have to fight the government. They can just build a mall instead of lobbying against the government, and they would still get a lot of money because no one wants to buy houses in the area, which then suggests to us that we actually get the benefits that they want. But finally, they said most people actually do want to rent. I do agree with them that most people want to rent now. I'm very broke. But the reason why is because these large corporations buy up the homes, right? Like, what choice do you have if you look on the housing market and every apartment unit is now owned by a large corporation? You have to buy the rented apartment unit, either that or you have to go buy another house that's available on the market. But that's very, very scarce, right? We say, why have these corporations act as a middleman? You can just have individual landlords buy up these houses. And the reason why that's possible is because the prices of these houses drop if there's more of them available, because large corporations don't buy them up in bulk, which means that landlords are able to do that. But even if that's not the case, homeowners are able to buy up these houses because, again, they have the capacity to do this insofar as these private corporations don't cause a shortage in available housing, which ultimately means that they'll take up mortgages and buy up these houses. What's the trade-off that we're actually willing to take then? Ignoring all like the free market mechanism stuff, I think the trade-off is very clear that like these big corporations are really, really good at what they do. So like they maintain their apartments like really well placed. Fun fact, I just had to kill 6 cockroaches in my Airbnb last night because these individual landlords are terrible at managing their own houses. But we're okay with that. Like, if I have to stay in a place that has 6 cockroaches, but I don't have to pay 5-10 times the amount for that rented unit, I'm perfectly fine with doing that because I'm a broke bitch. For these reasons,
Alright. Right. This file.
Oh yeah, okay.